Hello and welcome to the Pop Pod. I am Sam, also known as Pop Sam Cam, and today we are celebrating 10 years of one of the best pop albums of the last 10 years, Rae Jepsen's Emotion. We are going to get into that very soon, but before we do, if you're not already following or subscribed to this podcast, make sure that you do so you can keep up with all the album anniversaries, all the pop music that we dive into on the weekly, and if you have it in you, rate 5 stars for this podcast wherever you're listening to it, because it really helps us with the visibility of the Pop Pod and growing it as well. Also, this one's for you. If you want to join the Discord, you can. I'll drop the link in the show notes below. That's where we're chatting all about pop music on the daily, extensively. Whatever you want to get off your chest, you can drop it in there. But let's get into it. 10 years of Rae Jepsen's Emotion. Emotion, released in June 2015, was Rae Jepsen's second album and came after the release of her debut Kiss, which of course spawned Call Me Maybe, a #1 single that was the biggest song of the year that it was released and basically turned Carly into a star overnight. It was supported by the likes of Justin Bieber and just blew up as one of the first real viral pop moments in the 2010s. It was a hard task, or it was always going to be a hard task to follow up this record. And I think Carly really felt the pinch. She wrote a lot of songs for Emotion, the second record, 200 songs actually, or over 200 songs. She was in and out of songwriting sessions with some of the biggest writers and producers in the world, and it took a little while for her to land on this album. It comes 3 years after the release of her debut, and for lack of a better word, it basically has a pretty floppy rollout. I don't mean to sound very internet speak, but it's hard to describe it in any other way. It is so difficult to follow up a hit that's as big as Call Me Maybe.
Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy, but here's my number, so call me maybe.
And she had a couple of other minor hits off Kiss. She had Tonight I'm Getting Over You, which was produced by Max Martin.
Tonight I'm getting over you. Tonight I'm getting over you.
She had Good Time, her collab with Our City, which actually ended up going into the top 10.
We don't even have to try, it's always a good time.
So she had seen some more success that suggested that maybe that she could take this record to a new point. But the first single, I Really Like You, which clearly had a huge budget. It had a music video that featured Justin Bieber and also Tom Hanks. It only peaks just within the top 30 of the Billboard Hot 100 and fell off pretty quickly, and immediately suggested that it was going to be quite hard for Carly to get another hit the size of Call Me Maybe. Emotion had a slightly different sound to what Call Me Maybe had suggested. I Really Like You in particular had these big, bounding 80s sort of drums and this chorus that was maybe even more anthemic than what Call Me Maybe was. Call Me Maybe had this cute, maybe flirty vibe to it. I Really Like You went full in. It was just like an arms wide open pop song. And it suggested where Emotion was going to go, but it was perhaps the most commercial song on the record. And I don't mean that in the sense that Emotion is a weird pop record. It certainly isn't. It's a straight down the line pop record. But I Really Like You had that kind of melodic chorus that felt like it could match the success of Call Me Maybe. Whereas the rest of Emotion perhaps takes a little more thinking, a little more digging to get into it. After that single, I think the record label kind of panicked because things got a little messy. This album was actually released in Japan before it was released in the rest of the world months later, so it had essentially leaked to the whole world before that. The second single, Run Away With Me, didn't do anything at all on the charts, despite it being another anthemic 80s moment with this howling brass that introduces it with so much fanfare, one of Carly's finest moments. What that song did do though is it started to prick up the ears of critics. And to really understand what emotion does after this, we need to understand the climate that we're in 2015. So some of the biggest records of 2015 are by artists like Drake and Justin Bieber. The sound of pop wasn't extremely 80s led, but Taylor Swift had a lot of success with 1989, the year prior, and was also working on Reputation, which was also delve into the 80s sounds a lot. But there was this moment happening, and I remember this quite clearly because if you don't already know, I'm from Australia. Australia has a very strange history with pop music, as do many countries in the world. A lot of people saw it at the time as uncool, manufactured, overproduced, and it was really hard for artists like Rae Jepsen to get any kind of kudos. But I think 1989 had shifted things up a bit, where people were starting to admit that they were Swifties, and then I distinctly remember Justin Bieber's Justice record hitting. And sorry, it wasn't Justice, it was Purpose. I knew it was something with a lot of gravity to it. He loves a real inspirational album title. But I distinctly remember him releasing that album and people really coming around to the production on that because they were seeing it as something a little cooler. It had production from Skrillex, from Diplo, and because of that, he was starting to get some street cred. And all the while, this like poptimism movement is starting to happen, and we're starting to get albums like this critically evaluated in a way that they just weren't on sites like Pitchfork and stuff like that. And that kind of aligns with sites like that becoming more popular and becoming like needing the clicks more. And of course, pop music is where you're going to find that. But it does mean that we have this critical reevaluation of pop stars that would have previously just been dismissed in that kind of world. And I really like seeing that happen. And I think it's also happening at the same time as we're starting to see artists like Charlie XCX and Robin carve out a path for pop that was not always there. I think there was such a line between alternative pop music and then also mainstream pop music. I mean, you almost had to make a choice about what you were doing. Of course, there are outliers to that in terms of artists like Bjork and Kate Bush who managed to operate quite confidently in those two worlds. But as we move further away from the 80s and into the 2000s, it is very difficult to tick the boxes in both sides. You almost, as soon as you have chart success, you make that decision and it's very hard to pick up the cool street cred again. But Robin and Charlie XCX particularly had imagined a path that was very different to that. I mean, Charlie XCX had a lot of commercial success with Sucker, Boom Clap, and of course Fancy, the song she wrote for Iggy Azalea and featured on the hook of it. And then she decided very purposefully to go in a different direction, and she releases the Vroom Vroom EP with Sophie and makes something that is very dependent on sugary pop melodies, the kind that we've become so used to hearing on the radio, but is using production that is not very mainstream, the very visionary production of Sophie. And Robin was also doing a similar thing with her Body Talk record that came years prior, which is she wasn't really gunning for mainstream radio hits. She'd been very clear that she didn't really like that world that she'd been in when she released the Max Martin assisted Show Me Love really early in her career. And she decided that she was going to do things independently and alternatively and make music that was still pop music, but wasn't chasing trends and wasn't chasing chart success. And of course, that births Dancing on My Own, Call Your Girlfriend, everything that comes from that era. And I think that's important to note when it comes to Rae Jepsen's emotion, because it's the kind of path that she starts to take. Now, you could say that this path was accidental, certainly. I mean, once you've had a huge hit and you can't follow it up, it's kind of easy to be like, well, that's not what I was going for anyway. I'm moving in a different direction. But I do kind of believe it when it comes to emotion. And here's why I believe it. Because Charlie, why do they have to be doing similar things? Carly was basically offered every songwriter on the planet for this record. As I said at the beginning, she wrote over 200 songs. She had the world falling at her feet, basically. She had Max Martin on Tonight, I'm Getting Over You. It's also been storied that she worked with Max Martin on this record on plenty of songs that didn't make it onto the album. And I think from working with all these people, she decides that maybe doing that kind of chart-chasing music is not exactly what she's after. And instead, she assembles a group of producers that really inspire her more than anything. She spends a lot of time in Sweden working on this record and is incredibly inspired by them. But she's also inspired by things that are happening on the periphery of pop music in the US, particularly what Solange did with Dev Hynes on Losing You. She said she was a fan of that. She's also inspired by the work of Rostam. Rostam was a Vampire Weekend and then peeled away and started working on his own stuff as well as his own production work. And she also loves Haim, the trio of sisters that are coming up in the alternative pop world as well, and are making music that's not necessarily for the American charts, but is very, very rooted in pop music. And in doing that, she makes an album that is almost alternative leaning, but also just shows a deep appreciation for pure pop. And the coolest thing about this album is it does end up featuring people like Dev Hynes, Rostam, the Haim sisters. But it has such an undeniable love for pop music in its most purest escapist form. And this is cool to see at this time because Poptimism is only just beginning. And Carly goes full throttle into it and is like, I'm going to make an album that is just a pure dedication to the fundamentals of pop music, the 80s fundamentals of pop music. Whitney Houston, I Want to Dance with Somebody. Tina Turner, What's Love Got to Do with It? The work of Prince is all over this record as well. There's even some Kate Bush in it, but she's very defiant in making music that just has those like undeniable, purest pop choruses. And that's not necessarily cool at this time. It's maybe the reason why 1989 gets on people's nerves by Taylor Swift, to be honest, because it is so outwardly proud of its pure pop melodies. And I think that's why people start falling in love with this. The kind of people that are falling in love with this album are Y2K kids. And I mean that in terms of people who are forming their music taste in Y2K by listening to people like Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, those kind of like Max Martin-esque pop stars who were very unashamed in just making really great pop melodies, but with really cool production surrounding it. And I think around this time, we're starting to have a little bit of indie alternative fatigue. We've gone through a long period of having acts like Mumford & Sons, Bon Iver, Vampire Weekend, those kind of acts infiltrate the mainstream. And we'd spent a lot of time trying to be cool. And maybe at this point, we were just ready to embrace the pure joy that comes through with this record. And it really does. Let's talk about emotion. Let's talk about the music that's on it. Specifically, we've talked about the context of this album, but what does it actually do? It is a total dedication to the 80s. It almost doesn't deviate from that at all. I'm talking about big drums. I'm talking about howling brass. I'm talking about choruses where she's singing at the top of her lungs. Everything about this album is kind of maximalist. And then when it's not, it really shines through. I mean, we've already talked about I Really Like You and Run Away With Me. I just think those are two fine pop records. Just so good. But then think about Give Me Love and that pulsating beat that just like almost ricochets through your chest.
Give me love, give me love, give me love, give me love, give me touch. 'Cause I want what I want, do you think that I want too much? Give me love, give me love, give me love, give me love.
Boy Problems. It's almost corny the way that she talks about those lyrics.
What problems? Who's got 'em? I've got 'em too.
There is something quite juvenile about the way she talks about love on this album, but that's almost by design. Think about I Want to Dance with Somebody by Whitney Houston. The lyrics of that are quite juvenile as well, and they capture love in a very uncomplicated sense. But that's the point of pop music. It's meant to be universal. It's meant to like have these lyrics that almost err on the cliche, but then also manage to grab at your heart in some way. And the middle part of this record particularly does that with Boy Problems and Making the Most of the Night. Making the Most of the Night is the song that the Haim sisters are in. And because of that, it does have a bit of an alt rock, like kind of Sheryl Crow slant to it as well, which I really like. But when I talk about it, her counteracting that with some of the cooler, more subtle moments, these are the moments for me that really shine through. The first one is All That, which is a song that she made with Dev Hynes. It is very reminiscent of some of the work on Solange's True, the EP that she made with him. And it's got this kind of smoky, slow burning vibe to it that allows her to put her vocals over it in a way that we just simply didn't hear on Kiss.
So if you want me, if I'm alright, I will be your friend.
It's so smoldering the way that she approaches this song, and I think that it's so cool. It builds so gently and then reaches this climax that is not maximalist at all like the rest of the record, but really just sinks in so nicely. There's also Your Type, which is a song that I absolutely love.
I'm not the type girl for you. I'm not going to pretend. I'm the type of girl you call more than a friend.
I think that the way that she is able to make that certain tone come out in her voice that's quite smoky, and Carly usually has quite a pure voice. I'm trying to recall a story where she smoked before the vocal session for this, or she vaped or something like that to get that tone out, but it just really works, and it has so much melodrama in it as well. I feel like it's such a cool song. And then we also get Warm Blood, which is the song that Rostam produced, which is just done so well. It almost mimics a heartbeat, and at its most like muted, as if you just put your ear up to somebody's chest. It is so, so good.
One blood feels good. I can't control it anymore. Sweet one, you should stop me there, but I'll keep on talking.
There are so many fine moments on this album, and in a way, like, the pop writing is so strong on this and so straight to the point that it's almost like every single song could be a single, and yet none of them could be either, because this didn't sound like anything that was on the radio at the time in this kind of post-EDM world that we were living in. And I think that that is so cool. There's this alternative universe where Carly released an album that was just totally chasing hits, and she fell flat on her face. And Emotion did fall flat on its face. It didn't even chart in the top 10 of the US charts. It basically did nothing in terms of commercial appeal for her, but it created this really important audience, and it's one that we've come to understand so much more in the last couple years, particularly with what Charli XCX did with Brat. And it's this audience where the niche becomes so powerful because the people that followed Carly at this point were locked in for life because they just fell in love with this record so much. And because it didn't perform so well commercially, they also felt like they had some ownership over it because they were part of a not super small, but a small-ish group of people who loved this record and rode for it. And for a long time, I remember Emotion feeling like a bit of a secret. And it was funny because by making this kind of straight down the line pop record, she ends up becoming a bit of an alternative darling. She gets reviewed well on Pitchfork. She plays Pitchfork Festival, which is certainly something that you couldn't have imagined for her years prior. And she starts playing all these slightly alternative leaning festivals at a time when pop stars aren't really being invited to play these festivals other than like Coachella, which was embracing them in a big way. She starts to become this kind of like alt star while also just making pop music. And I feel like it's so influential in the artists that come after it. Just one who mentions Emotion as a big influence is Maggie Rogers, which I feel like is really important because last year I saw Maggie Rogers at Madison Square Garden. She hasn't really had a major hit, and yet she sold out 2 nights at the Gardens in New York, one of the most prestigious venues that you can play. The role that these pop artists play has just changed so much, where you can literally not touch the charts once, and you can still be selling out huge venues and have this incredible notoriety. And I feel like this is such a fundamental moment in that. And obviously Charlie XCX and Robin as well, which I mentioned before, and also Tuve Lu, who starts to kind of carve that path later. But it's really cool to see these stars have this massive moment commercially and then be like, I just prefer making the music I want to make, and I'm going to do that. And it's why Emotion gets so much rep after it is released, and the cult of Rae Jepsen just continues to build. Even 10 years later, I think it's still building. And she reimagines this totally different way of making pop music that I just think opened up her career so much and allowed her to do so much more interesting work. I think one of the fundamentals of this is the fact that she releases side B to Emotion, which artists release a deluxe edition, yes, but releasing a whole new project that is basically the offcuts of the album, and then fans find more moments that they love, maybe even more than some of the moments on the album, I think is so impressive. People love side B so much so that she was still performing songs from the side B of this album like years and years later, particularly when I saw her around the Dedicated era. And then she starts to do this with all of her albums after that. Every single album she's released after that has had a side B. And you just can't do this if you're competing for the charts and you're in the mainstream, because the record labels are so focused on numbers and they can't afford to have you just kind of put out a side B and not promote it in the same way you would a regular album and have it fail. It doesn't look good. But for the fans of Rae Jepsen that are so tapped in and so obsessed with everything she does, it's just a constant reward to them. We're essentially getting 2 for 1 all the time, and the quality is always there. I think particularly with The Loveliest Time, which was the album that came after her last official studio album, The Loneliest Time, a lot of that material was better than what ended up on the original album. But it's also such an important insight into the thought process that goes behind making an album and what goes into like what makes the full official track list and what is left off. And like, there's this kind of lore behind the songs that don't make it in the end. And I think that's just so cool for fans to be able to see that. So I guess what I take away from this 10 years later is Carly really starts to envision a different path for a pop artist that isn't so focused on the charts. And I don't even think this conversation comes up that often anymore because it just sort of happens. There are so many artists around making music like this right now. I'm just thinking off the top of my head of people like Pink Pantheress and even Magdalena Bay and Clairo and what Kesha's doing right now. Like, there are so many artists who don't have to have their eye completely on the mainstream charts to have success. And I think that just takes so much pressure off and it allows so much more artistic freedom. And because of that, we've got an artist who could have been quite weighed down in the major label chart chasing system. But instead, she's been able to develop her artistry over the last 10 years, and it's led us to the artist that we know now. She's so beloved. I think had she made a really like commercial post EDM record and it had fallen flat, she would have just kind of like gone off into the ether and we wouldn't have heard from her again. But instead, she's been able to build this cult following that is so dedicated, excuse the pun, to her. And it all traces back to this record, Emotion, which to me is one of the finest pop records of the last 10 years, easily. I think that her expertise in just cutting straight to the point is unmatched on this record. The word that just keeps coming up to me is just total purity. Purity in the directness of it, purity in the voice, purity in the melody, purity in the productions. Like, it's just so glossy and so brilliant. And I absolutely love that about it. I think that Emotion is top tier, unbeatable record what I do with all of these albums when I talk about the albums that change pop, and this is a series, by the way. We've done albums by Taylor Swift, Charlie XCX, so you can go back and see that all in the podcast feed if you want to return to some old episodes. But I always rank my top 3 from the album at the end of it, and I'm going to do it with emotion. So let's get started with number 3. In number 3, I am going to do Warm Blood. This is a song to me that I was just obsessed with from the outset, because I think that while it is such a pure pop song, the production is so cool and muted, and it almost holds back on the emotion until the very last minute and then just totally explodes. I love that. I think that Ross Dahm is a genius producer. I love the work that he's done with Haim and Clairo, and I think he brings some of his best work here to the Carly record. My second favorite song, it's so hard because I just love so many songs off this album, but I'm going to go with Your Type. As I said, like, I've really fallen in love on this record with some of the more downbeat moments, and I think that there's a yearning to this song, a desperation to the way that she sings that just sucks me in immediately. I think that it is so cool. I love it. And in number 1, I'm going to go with Runaway With Me. I don't think there's any other choice, to be honest. This is one of the finest pop songs released in the last 10 years. It has a momentum and an energy to it that is so cool. It like feels like a Labrador running across a park, like wind in hair. It is so escapist. Like, when we talk about escapist pop and euphoric pop, I really don't think you can get much better than this one. And when I think of like top tier pop songs, the first ones that come to my mind is always Robin Dancing on My Own and Carly Rae Jepsen Run Away With Me. I think that they exist in like similar worlds, even though sonically, production-wise, they're quite different. They have quite different moods, but they capture that same sense of euphoria that only pop music can do when it's done at its absolute best. And Carly does that so well on this album. Emotion is incredible. If you would like to talk further about it, make sure you join the Discord. I'll drop the link below in the show notes for that. I would love to know your favorite songs from this album. What was the first time you listened to it? I know a lot of people like picked up on it at different points throughout its lifespan, and I think that would be interesting to hear. If you're not already following or subscribed to this podcast, make sure you're subscribed to the Pop Pod. You can also find us on Instagram, where we put out new content on there every time we drop an episode. And also don't forget to rate us 5 stars if you can. I will see you on the next episode tomorrow for Bop or Flop. Until then, have a great day, and I will speak to you soon.